I. Abortion was, therefore, quite popular because there just wasn't space enough in the government provided room for another person and another mouth to feed. Does all that sound like utopia or heaven on earth? Welcome to socialism. Pardon the skepticism. But if I am living well enough to attract the attention of a socialist government which thinks I am too well off, and they decide to move others into my home and I have nothing to say about it, I'm going to be pretty steamed. And so would millions of American homeowners, ergo the constant obsession of the Democrat left to disarm America. They can't afford to alienate tens of millions of citizens who own guns. That may be where Americans finally say enough. The Constitution says the government can't quarter soldiers in your home by force. So do we need legislation to add that the government can't quarter homeless people in your home by force? I'm the one who earned the money to pay my mortgage, and new residents will have contributed nothing. But these strangers get to move into my house anyway. Is that what some naive Americans are coming to believe to be a fairer system? This is not the part of socialism being taught to our young people today by leftist professors in America, by Bernie Sanders, or other socialists. Before we move on from this explanation, ask yourself this question. If we go full socialism, what happens to the 14th Amendment to our Constitution, which says the government cannot take away your life, liberty, or property without due process of law? If they start ignoring that, the whole Constitution will likely get dumped. My concern, if not my warning, is that if the Democrats take us down the road to socialism, they will apply a very damaging definition to what due process means, or will delete it altogether. They are already working on the First and Second Amendments, so why not rewrite the rest of the founding document? Soviet Russia had a constitution very similar to America's, but it was not always followed, and the government was too big for citizens to do much about it. Sooner or later will we face civil war like Russia did? Or will all of us armed citizens willingly give up our freedoms, our guns, our constitution, which the progressives think is outdated anyway, our property, our businesses, our way of life, and surrender to the radical left, which is now running more than their share of our federal government anyway, thanks to a fraudulent vote accomplished partly with foreign interference in the November 2020 election? As a point of fact, illegal elections are a routine part of the electoral process in Putin's Russia to keep him in permanent power. Sound familiar? The sad part is that our young voters and future leaders don't realize that totalitarianism follows on the heels of socialism. If you don't believe it, go visit China, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, or Vietnam for starters. To make another point, Venezuela used to be a very prosperous, oil-rich country. After going to socialism, 96% of its people now live in poverty. If only we in America could still see with clarity the dangers of socialism, which were so recognizable to Westerners during the Cold War, and which America fought two costly hot wars to contain. But we have very little frame of reference to either know or understand it, despite the outcries from immigrants who fled socialist states to come here, and who are now warning us about making this move toward socialism, especially on my part. A North Korean girl who escaped her homeland at the age of 13 and now warns the West about what it's like to live in a socialist/communist society. Worse yet, the installation of socialism in America would herald the end not only of freedom and prosperity, but of Christianity. In other words, everything that built this country. But hasn't that been Satan's goal all along? How better to achieve it than to force an atheistic/Marxist system on one nation, under God, in which we will simply become one nation. No mention of God. By the way, the free government-provided living quarters in Soviet Russia mentioned above were assigned. In other words, you lived where the government said you would live. Now here's where it gets a bit thorny. Since the government owned all means of production, all the people technically worked for the government. Remember what we said that during those socialist times, if a man was 10 minutes late to work, he was sent to prison. What if he'd been assigned by bureaucrats to live in a flat or communalka that was quite distant from his job? He'd have a problem in getting to work if he missed his transportation in a place where he'd have to travel by bus, train, or subway. What about traffic accidents that interfere with travel? It happens to all of us now and then and makes us late for work. But, as though that wasn't bad enough, try this. If a married couple got divorced, they had to keep living together until the government could get around to reassigning one of them to other living quarters, and it could take several months. How comfortable would it be to continue living with your spouse after your divorce and the arguing continues? What about trying to move on and have a social life? But, again, that's what happens when too much power is surrendered to the government, and this is another side of socialism that isn't being taught to American youth. Martin Luther King once insisted that socialism and Christianity cannot peacefully coexist. In a sermon at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, on September 30, 1962, Dr. King said communism was a necessary corrective for a Christianity that has been all too passive and a democracy that has been all too inert. After all this having been said, what can we make of it? It seems that Satan, working through godless communists and others who are equally atheistic, and whose deities are money and power, is seducing people into believing less and less in God by putting the best, albeit deceitful, spin on what socialism is and what it brings, but ignoring the downside of it. He is trying to cause one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, to become literally, fiscally, and morally bankrupt and irrelevant in world affairs in the hope that other Western nations will follow suit. Then does Satan get his one world government where the Antichrist rises to a position of authority therein. That seems to be the plan that eschatologists are leaning toward. For the whole story, read your Bible, where you will find that Bible prophecy tells us what happens next, and it won't be pretty. For a clearer and more detailed understanding of world events, how Satan is using governments, and the Chinese virus, see the website of Olive Tree Ministries. Click on the video titled Antichrist Kingdom Rising and watch both part 1 and 2 if for any reason you can't find it. Contact Jan Markle at Olivetry Ministries. Come and ask about it. She has it on DVD. In America's 2020 presidential election, it was clear to the intelligence community that there was foreign interference. Foreign interference was the Democrats' theme song in the 2016 election that put Donald Trump between them and their obsessive goals. But after spending $35 million to prove it by the Mueller investigation, they came up empty-handed. Of course, we have said the Russia collusion investigation was nothing more than an attempt to deflect public attention away from Hillary Clinton's illegal, if not treasonous, bathroom-based server. They even called Donald Trump a Russian asset trying to undermine his campaign to become president. Donald Trump was not a Russian asset. But Joe Biden doesn't pass that same smell test when Hunter Biden owns a piece of a bank that belongs to the Chinese Communist Party, and the big guy is getting his share. Anybody wonder how that happened? The leftists jump-started every meme in their power to convince Americans that Donald Trump was not only a Russian asset and a puppet of Vladimir Putin, but was unqualified to be president because his neckties were too long, his wife was too hot, and his socks didn't match. But they are silent on the Biden-China connection. In 2016, they did everything and used every trick they could think of to steal the election for Hillary Clinton, an admitted progressive whose college thesis featured Saul Alinsky, whom she admired. In the 2020 election, however, there was provable foreign interference, but not to Trump's advantage. It was a coalition of at least Iran and China, presently non-Christian and presently atheist communist, who worked to help steal the election for his opponent, Joe Biden.